Our guest today is the economist Luigi Zingales. Professor Zingales is a professor at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He is the co-host as well of the podcast Capitalisn't and the co-author of the book, how to say in English is protecting capitalism against, saving capitalism against capitalism. Yes, as I remember the name in Portuguese. And we are here today to talk about cryptocurrencies, one of the fields that Professor Zingales have been studying in the last years. So, Professor, in a testimony before the European Parliament's Committee of Economic and Monetary Affairs, it happened recently, you said 4 powerful forces threaten the traditional international monetary system. Could you elaborate on that? Which are these forces?
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So the second one is that as a result of the digitization of money, there is really a separation between geographical and the monetary boundaries of a country, because in the old days, the reason why as a Brazilian, I will find it difficult to pay in reais in Mexico is not because the Mexicans did not trust the reais more than they trust the pesos, is because for small transactions, if I am a merchant and I need to send eventually the reais back to Brazil, it's expensive and I don't want to take the cost. But today, if I'm a Brazilian and I'm going to Mexico, I can pay with digital currency, and the digital currency can be exchanged and instantaneously into the currency of choice of the Mexican retailers, basically, potentially at least, at no cost. Mm-hmm. And so this makes it the phenomenon of dollarization that Latin American countries and Brazil in particular are so familiar with historically, much, much more pervasive. Because in the old days, it took a very high inflation, hyperinflation, to force people off their normal currency. But today, this might happen naturally, especially in a highly integrated world. Because let's take the country, and it's not a coincidence I use this country, the Bahamas. Their major source of revenues is tourism from the United States. And so it's quite natural that people will start to accept US dollars, especially if these are digital. And pretty quickly, the US dollar can become the denomination of choice of every transaction in the Bahamas. The third force is that, like in every other sector of the economy, now there is a new source of competition that comes from the big ad-based digital platforms. So imagine the moment in which Facebook were to introduce a currency, maybe a cryptocurrency, to do exchange across the world. Now, Facebook will be able to subsidize the cost of the transactions because in the process, it collects data. And so that will make it a formidable competitor for every other financial institution. So this is coming, as we know from the announcement of Facebook. Digital platforms are pretty much clamoring to enter into this business. And so the pressure is very, very large. And last but not least, there is an increasing value of the data, not just economic value, but also political or geopolitical value as well. I think that the first responsible here is the United States of America, because since 2001, they've used the monopoly they have on the network, which is basically the dollar-based banking system, to enforce every kind of sanctions. And when the initial battle was to fight the terrorists that brought down the Twin Towers, I think everybody agreed. Mm-hmm. But then when you see that one US administration decide to lift the tariffs on Iran, and the next one brings them back, and the third one might be revert, and etc. I think many partners, especially European partners, who are natural partners for Iran, say, wait a minute, why am I forced not to do transaction in Iran because somebody else said it? This is called extraterritoriality. So I think that all these forces are really changing the game of central banking around the world.
Still, there are some people that say that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are just bubbles, like a tulip bubble. For example, Nassim said that yesterday. And how do you see it? How do you see the role of this kind of currencies in the near future, both as in terms of a means of transaction and as a reserve of value?
Actually, when it comes to Bitcoin, I agree with Nassim Taleb. In fact, I think that Bitcoin is at best bubble, at worst is an instrument for tax evasion and tax elusion and other worse crimes. So I think that it's very important to separate the future of Bitcoin itself from the future of various forms of cryptocurrency, from the future of the international financial system. Even if, and I don't go in that direction, but even if you had to say that all cryptocurrency were a bubble, I think that the pressure, even bubbles have pressure, and the pressure is a pressure to change. The international financial system is old. The way we send money back and forth around the world is based on SWIFT that was created in the 1970s, okay? You were probably not born in the 1970s. I had short trousers back then. The world was completely different, okay? And the fact that we're still relying on that system is an indication of how isolated this sector has been so far. And I think it's to some extent welcome that there is some pressure.
And still there is this resistance from the Federal Reserve, from the United States, from other countries to do something different. So how should they respond? Because we are seeing here a threat to the constitution of a parallel, a shadow international financial system.
I think that the response is very different depending on the country. I was at the meeting with your central bank governor, and I said a bit sort of pushing, but I said that Brazil is perfectly positioned to start its own central bank digital currency. Why? Because I think is large enough that this currency might become influential. And so if you are Paraguay, if you are Uruguay, even Argentina, given the, they might decide that adopting the real is better than being left with their own currency, or depend on a US dollar that in the future might be much more viable. So on that front is a big advantage. The other big advantage, paradoxically, and this is where the governor did not follow me, but the other big advantage, paradoxically, is how bad the banking sector is. Because let's face it, if you allow individuals to deposit their money at the central bank, like what is the central bank digital currency is about, you are undermining a major source of comparative advantage of banks. And in the process, you run the risk of decreasing lending to the economy, and so having a very negative impact on the economy. Now, first of all, with the money you save in or you gain in seigniorage, you can provide very effective and targeted subsidy to lending if that's what you want. But two, Brazilian banks are not really very good at lending long-term to firms. They do a little bit of consumer lending and a little bit of short-term lending to discount account receivables. But this stuff can be quite effectively substituted by fintech platforms. And so if you are a country like Italy, for example, where banks play a central role in the survival of the industrial economy, I think that doing that transition could be very, very costly. But Brazil, I don't think is in that position.
And you draw that parallel with India, because you said that there are basically three responses to this new world. Let's say the response to kind of China, what kind of China is doing, what India is doing, and what the United States and other rich countries are not doing. I mean, leaving to the private sector, and there is this. I don't know. You said as well that can draw some comparisons with other tech companies. Do you think that you can see the constitution of monopolies, for example, in specific markets, the same way that Google is the leading company in a determined industry, or Facebook or Amazon and so on? Do you think that we can have competing currencies leading different markets and threaten in a way the traditional system?
So let me indulge in my academic talk, because one of the interesting things about being in Chicago, you have all this history about the various Chicago debates. And not a lot of people know that one of the big source of tensions between Hayek and Friedman, that in many things were on the same side, but one of the big source of tension was exactly in the role of money. So for Friedman, money was one of the few things that belonged to the government and the government should administer. And Hayek was much more aggressive and said, no, that you should have the denationalization of money, the privatization of money. And he envisioned a world of perfect competition among different currencies. Now, to some extent, they both were wrong, or they both were right, depending on the point of view. I think that competition among currencies will not be perfect competition, because we know now very well there are huge network externalities. So I think that the world will converge in relatively few currencies. That's the reason why, not surprisingly, the Bahamas were front hand in the introduction of a digital currency, because they know that Bahamas is a small country and they run the risk of being dollarized tomorrow. Brazil does not run the risk of dollarized tomorrow, but it does run this risk. And on the other hand, there's an opportunity to be a center of gravity, because we're probably going to have a 4 or 5 major currency that correspond in part to the geographic areas, in part to the underlying economy. So if you are an economy mostly based on commodities, it's very different than you're an economy mostly based on biotech and high tech. So I think that, and of course, on the credibility of the institutions. And so I think we're going to go to a world with few currencies. And the question is whether the real is going to be one of those, or is going to be part of history.
Yes, and you quoted Latin America and the role that Brazil can have it. But now what we are seeing is that due to the commodities export, the Latin American center is much closer to China. Argentina probably today is much closer to China than to Brazil. So there is this risks, let's say, as well, to diverse part of these transactions that today are made through a let's say a system under the radar of the authorities to a new system. For example, the transaction direct from Argentina to China with a completely different system and not under the radar of the Western authorities. So
I think that it's pretty clear that if you look from purely economic perspective, China and Brazil is the perfect match. They're meant to marry each other, and I think that Bolsonaro is a big wrench thrown in the middle of this perfect marriage. Now, it will be interesting to see whether there is a future Lula presidency, how this will play, because it can change dramatically. However, I think that would be, even this said, I think would be kind of a risk, in my view, for Brazil to marry so closely China to adopt their currency. And I think Brazil stands a chance to become a polar center in Latin America, both for its size and also for its credibility. And it's just what are the alternatives? Argentina, give me a break. Mexico, first of all, is too much North America, and so Chile is too small to become a center. So I think that it's a natural magnet and can really capitalize on that if it push this strongly.
Perfect. Just to conclude our talk, Professor, how far can cryptocurrencies go? What size of the pie can they grab? Because if you're thinking young people, youngsters, they don't watch television anymore. They don't read in traditional paper books. So they are moving very fast to digital currencies. It's very likely to imagine them not using credit cards and cash and so on. So how far can this go?
So you very sort of subtly move from cryptocurrency to digital currency. I think it's very important that the listeners appreciate the difference. So yes. When I send you a wire transfer from the United States to Brazil, I'm using the digital currency. I'm not using a cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency, strictly in the strict sense of the word, are currencies that are decentralized and not backed by any central bank. And I think that the power of this is fairly limited, short of a revolution or something really crazy. I think that the central banks so far in the Western countries have done fairly well for the last 40 years. And so the cryptocurrency desire is more like a myth in search of a need rather than a response to a real need. Now, clearly there is a real need to evade taxes. There's a clear need to do illegal transaction. There's a lot of other stuff that goes along, but those are, in my view, relatively small markets, and they will be contained eventually by the regulators and the pressure. So I think that the space is limited for crypto. I think is infinite for digital. And in my office here, you cannot see, but in my office, I have a little collection of little checks that were introduced in Italy in the middle of the 70s, when there wasn't enough coins to change, and the banks were creative and created these mini checks that would be used back and forth. And as a kid, I was fascinated by that. I collected, and now they are a collected item, but they're not anywhere. And I think that the bills that you and I use now are going to end up in the on the walls of our children or grandchildren. They're not going to be used. I think we're all going to be digital. That's for sure.